Yeah, okay. We'd like to really welcome Trevor Birkenholtz. Birkenholtz, all right. To deliver this talk on surplus and security. He's going to talk about the India's National River Linking Project. Professor is an associate professor of geography in University of Illinois in urban metropole, USA. A political ecologist. That's okay, you know. It's all there, you can read that. Just to listen to what you have to say. You know, frankly, I have a kind of a deja vu. I mean, I worked in Rajasthan, all those areas in the late 90s, with an American friend of ours, Marcus. He also fat. So मैंने इनको पूछा हिंदी बोलते हैं मैं बोलता हूँ what about Nepali बोलते नेपाली वाले भी बोलते and now Marcus' friend always got confused between Hindi and Nepali. You know, he never learned Nepali because he started to learn Nepali, but then Hindi would come. So maybe you know that's not the case with you. You know, interesting. You said you work on drip irrigation. You know, we're working on Rajasthan. We're working on conservation, trying to address scarcity, right? So what farmers were doing in Rajasthan those days was to, you know, promoting sprinkler irrigation. The sprinkler would improve efficiency of water. So therefore, it would minimize, you know, overconsumption. But what essentially happened, we found out, was even in the dunes, you know, instead of just the you know normal land, farmers started to even use sprinklers in the dune. So the actual acreage area on the irrigation increased. So instead of conserving water, the consumption, the amount of water consumed increased. That's one. Other one, he talks about, you know, the rural-urban transfer of water. When we worked in hard rock area, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Karnataka, essentially what we find out is the traditional wells in those areas. You know, you have these big wells. You know, unlike in Kathmandu, it's about 50 feet by 50 feet and about 70 feet wide. What you see is competitive deepening of the wells. You know, the well belongs to a family, so you have like a land is fragmented. So therefore, if you have four brothers in a family, a well is divided into four sections. One section, one section, one section. So the well owners would do competitive drilling. That is, you know, one brother would go on deepening his site, and others, because they don't have money, they don't have resources, they will not be able to do that. And then use high-powered different kind of pumps, not to irrigate, but essentially pump that water and transfer it to condominiums in, you know, the urban sprawl. You know, that's a trend. You know, that was emerging. And you mentioned about that. You mentioned about, you know, river linking, essentially allowing that rural-urban transfer, and then not for irrigation, for the drinking water. All right. So therefore, without further ado, we look forward to this interesting talk. In fact, many years ago, when Himal asked me to write a paper on river linking, I started with a sentence I remember, late Mukesh, जिस देश में गंगा बहती है, you know, हम उस देश के वासी हैं जिस देश में गंगा बहती है. I started with that and I ended with listening to a sort of, you know, a badly done remix of, you know, this देश में गंगा बहती है. That was the way I ended the sentence. Sorry, my article. So without further ado, Trevor ji, the floor is yours.
Sorry.
Tell us what do you think about. Tell us about surplus and scarcity.
Okay, I'll try. Should I use the microphone, or can people hear me okay?
I mean, they're recording, so it might be better to use.
Oh, use the microphone. Yeah, I think it's off, right?
Do you mind if I go and stay there?
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I'll just move some of this. Okay. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Yeah. I also want to thank Deepak Thapa and Haku Shonta, as well as Rita for organizing my talk and inviting me here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. As introduced, I'm Trevor Birkenholtz from the University of Illinois. Most of my work has been in Rajasthan and India on groundwater, actually. So I'm not a surface water specialist historically, but as I'll talk about a little bit today, the way that I've become interested in surface water and Indian river linking is that there are now linking rivers within Rajasthan as well. So part of my work is looking at irrigation, and I've really been passionate historically about examining irrigation. And so India is currently transferring a lot of water out of irrigation into urban spaces, ostensibly for urban drinking water, but much of that is going towards urban commercial and industrial uses. And so today I want to look at this tension within the river linking plan around India's notions of water surpluses and how they're used or not used. And to look specifically at a case in Himalaya, where I'm just starting to look as well to get a broader scope of the river linking program. And so I'll be talking today a little bit about the Mahakali and the Mahakali Treaty as India is trying to renegotiate that with Nepal just last month, actually, or in April rather. So I want to begin with a brief vignette. And so a few years ago I was at a workshop actually on urban socioecological resiliency in Bangalore. And there was a senior hydrologist there from the National Rainfed Area Authority in Delhi. And he started by showing two maps like this, one with population density on the left, and the other with average annual rainfall on the right. And he said, India has a problem. All of its population is in the northwest, meaning Delhi, which is not sure you can see from the map, but he was interested in talking about that. And all the heavy precipitation is in the northeast. So we have this problem, the rain is in the northeast, the people are in the northwest. We have a simple solution for this. We're going to move the water from the northeast to the northwest. I think at the time, people were a bit gobsmacked by this. This is a few years ago. But then in steps India's interlinking program or project. It goes by different names. I'm going to be talking about it and calling it today the Indian River Linking Project. And so just quickly, since I'm speaking in Nepal, how many people are familiar with this? So I'll not maybe go to in too much detail. So a few people, okay. So the project includes a Himalayan and a peninsular component, so which kind of cuts India in half right here. And they're proposing 30 interlinks in all. Some of them are within states within India, some of them are between states within India, and some of them are interstate, meaning international, between India and Nepal, India, Bangladesh, mostly. And so some of the details of the plans, as I said, it's 30 river links. There's some more being added to that, actually. Includes 3,000 storage structures, 15,000 kilometers of canals, 34 gigawatts of hydroelectricity, 174 trillion liters of water transferred annually throughout the subcontinent, and supposedly an increase in irrigated area of about 34 million hectares, at a cost of $168 billion. So this, if all of it happens, this will be the biggest surface water project that the world has ever seen by far. Oops. And so I want to ask three questions in today's talk. The first is, what's the history of the river linking plan? And I think that this history and how it was conceived, and in particular moments through which it was conceived, historical moments that is, bears on the present, and it shows something about how the Indian state is thinking about it. Second, then what assumptions about water scarcity are built into the plan? And then third, given these kinds of assumptions, how might the implementation of the plan affect changes in current water sharing agreements, particularly looking at the *96 Mahakali Treaty. So I want to focus on that towards the end of the talk. Okay, and I'm particularly interested in what people in the room have to say about that as well, because I'm coming at it from the Indian perspective as someone who does research in India, but I'm very interested in thinking about what debates are going on in Nepal right now around the reworking of this treaty. So first I want to talk a little bit about water security. And water security in the literature globally is often, I can put it in a typology of two different kinds really. The first is the human rights framework, which is fairly recent. And here researchers are focusing on access to potable water and sufficient supplies, and referring to that as a basic human right, And it's a basic human right, which was institutionalized in 2012 in the UN framework, which then enables the development of other capabilities. So the idea here is that, drawing on Amartya Sen, the famous Indian economist's work, that if people don't have access to potable water on a daily basis, it undermines their ability to enhance their other capabilities, right? To send their children to school, to further their own development capacities. And so this is gaining a lot of traction in international circles. Second is the state-centered framework, and this is a longer running framework, and it's a framework that I want to focus on today, which I believe infuses the Indian river linking project. So first is a kind of what political scientists call a realist notion of security, meaning that all states are pitted against each other in a scramble for resources. Okay, so in India's thinking, one might theorize that they're going to try to control as much water as they can, because if they don't, some other state, other country will begin to use it and control it. And it's in their own interest to control those water resources. So according to research in this vein, is that securing water is really about securing the needs of the state as a matter of national security. Okay, and so here, water and food security are often intertwined. So in the river linking plan, they often refer to food security, but food security is an outcome of water security. And then water, in this way of thinking, that is not being utilized, meaning dammed or used for irrigation or being used for urban development, is being wasted. So water in a river not being utilized is wasted if it's going into the ocean, for instance. And so this begins to bear itself out during the colonial period in India. So that first question I want to look at now is the history of this project. And so Sir Arthur Cotton, the famous British engineer, was the first one to devise a plan. And he worked on a plan to reverse the flow of northern rivers flowing, as he wrote, wastefully into the sea. Okay, so this dates back to the early mid-1800s. It comes up again really in the mid-20th century, which is a period of rapid demographic growth in India, right? Population growth, and also this kind of specter of population growth outstripping India's ability to produce food resources, right? During the 1970s, and we all know about Indira Gandhi's emergency and those other, what most people refer to as shameful moments in India's history. But in the 1980s, a barrage that Sir Arthur Cotton built in the mid-1800s in Andhra Pradesh, she christened and renamed the Arthur Cotton Barrage. Okay, and so what's interesting, I think, about this is that over 170 years later, 180 years later rather, Sir Arthur Cotton, as a colonial engineer, is still alive and well in the present of India's present, thinking about harnessing these rivers for the betterment of the Indian state, and that water not being utilized is being wasted. Okay, and so again, this is wrapped up in notions of water and food security as well. And then many of us know that in India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, was a vast proponent, large proponent of dam building. And so in 1963, he was credited with the creation, or after the construction of Baha Dam in the northwest. He wrote that this dam has been built with the unrelenting toil of man for the benefit of mankind, and therefore is worthy of worship. May you call it a temple or a gurdwara or a mosque. It inspires our admiration and reverence, right? And so the 1960s, 1970s was a period of what James Scott at Yale has called high modernism, of the Indian state trying to become modern, and in partly doing that, harnessing and gaining control over its water resources through the construction of large-scale hydroengineering works that would, in some ways, put India on the global stage with respect to harnessing its water and building dams like other large developed countries were doing at the time. And so it was in this context in the 1970s that the kind of river linking project reemerges yet again. And so Dr. K.L. Rao began theorizing that India ought to link the Ganga and Brahmaputra rivers, which are surplus areas. So this is the first time we see surface water systems within India being viewed as surplus with that language, while the south is a water deficit area. So he argued that we needed to link, or India at the time needed to link the Ganga and Kaveri, right, through almost a 2,700 kilometer long canal system. So that would go starting from here, the Ganga here, and all the way down to Tamil Nadu, right? And so again, this is the 1970s. There's a plan that was never really put into feasibility study system and was never enacted. But nonetheless, we have this river linking idea beginning in the colonial period and going through the 60s and 70s into the 80s with Indira Gandhi. And also in the 1970s, Dastur in 1977, who was not trained as an engineer. I should have noted Rao was a surface water engineer by training. Dastur was simply a captain in the army, or not simply, but he wasn't trained as an engineer.
I think he was a pilot, no?
Pilot, yeah, I think so, exactly. And so he came up with a plan where we see the first separation of the north and south with respect to a river linking plan. So he proposed 4,200 kilometers of new canals in the Himalayan area. So this green line here, going from the northwest to southeast, right? And then this southern canal system, which he called a garland, right? That would encircle much of peninsular India. And engineers at the time said this isn't technically feasible, and it wasn't clear what work this was going to do with respect to interlinking of rivers.
Where would water go in that?
In circles, right, yeah. Down into the Bay of Bengal, I think is where it was going anyway. And so this, again, appears and reappears over time. And so it wasn't really until the contemporary period in 2002 with Vajpayee who resurrected it. So from the 70s to the late 90s and the early 2000s, mostly Congress-led governments, and they were never interested in it. It was always something that the BJP was more interested in. And so in 2005 to 2013, the state conducted a series of feasibility studies. And some of you might know in 2012, the Supreme Court directed the Ministry of Water Resources at the time to constitute an expert committee to narrow in on a number of the possible feasibility of some of the links. And so as I noted, this produced the current plan. You probably, I don't know if you can see it, but this is one of the links that I'll talk just briefly about, but is in Andhra Pradesh. That's now completed. And so while the Indian state has been talking about this for literally centuries, now it's coming to fruition. And so I think the question is not if it's going to happen, but what links are going to happen and what links won't happen. And one of the things I'm trying to understand is how is it being financed. And so I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'm happy to answer questions on that. And so some of the assumptions built into the plan, first about physical scarcity, is that water scarcity is a physical problem, where many social scientists view water scarcity as a socially produced problem. There is physical water scarcity in some places, like where I work in Rajasthan. It's very dry. But in many parts of the world, and even there, water scarcity or lack of access to water for some, where it's socially stratified, is a political, economic, and institutional problem. But the plan doesn't view it that way. It really focuses on population. So here I'm quoting from the latest river linking plan. The population of India, which is around 1 billion people at present, is expected to increase to 1.5 to 1.8 billion by the year 2050. And that would require about 450 million tons of food grains. Right? So as I noted, food security is wrapped up in water security. For meeting this requirement, it would be necessary to increase irrigation potential to 160 million hectares for all crops by 2050. Right? So that's just in the next 30 years. And so, second, thinking about how does it view, or how is a notion of water surplus versus deficit and waste built into the plan. So just again to quote from the current plan, the total surface water available to our country is nearly 1,440 million acre feet, of which only 220 million acre feet are now being used. Right, the rest is flowing waste, causing disastrous sludge year after year. Okay, so we first see this notion of water flowing to the oceans as waste during the by Sir Arthur Cotton in the 1800s. We see that infused in this into the present. This is really a state-centered notion of water security, right? Which is water that's not harnessed for the betterment of the state becomes a national security issue. It's framed in these various ways. But as I'll talk a little bit about, the division's not so neat. So one of the things with the various feasibility studies is that none of them have been released to the public. So for instance, I have colleagues at IAT and another foundation in Bangalore who have tried to get access to the feasibility studies, who are scientists. The Indian state, Indian government will not release them. And they don't have to release them under freedom of information yet because they're still, as yet, unfinalized scientific documents. And so, but in the Himalayan area, sometimes, depending on the link, it actually links surplus areas to so-called surplus areas. So there are a number of problems just by looking at the, as a kind of armchair expert that this program has. And then third, the last assumption that the plan has is that this link between surplus areas and deficit areas and scarcity leads to the need for infrastructural solutions. Okay, so while I said that the plan focuses on water scarcity as a physical problem, then when water scarcity is viewed as a physical problem rather than a social, political, and economic problem, infrastructure becomes the only solution for that kind of a problem. And so it's path dependent in that way. Oops. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So again, quoting finally, this is the last quote I'll read. For attaining a potential of 160 million hectares of irrigation, that is, other strategies shall have to be evolved. Right? One of the most effective ways to increase the irrigation potential for increasing food grain production, mitigate floods and droughts, and reduce regional imbalance in the availability of water is an interbasin water transfer from surplus rivers to deficit areas. Right? So again, this kind of series of assumptions built into the plan leads to the only solution, which is the transfer of water through the interbasin transfer system. And again, indeed, as I said, this is underway. The Godavari Krishna in Andhra Pradesh is complete. This is an intrastate, meaning it's within Andhra Pradesh. It's right here. And then the Ken Betwa has been approved and is supposed to get underway any time. It's likely it's, in this one it's very contentious, going to submerge much of the Rana Tiger Reserve. And these are highlighted here, 4 and 10 in the plan. And so, but as I noted, I want to focus a bit from here on out on the Himalayan component. Hopefully you can see this. So here is the what India calls the Sarda-Yamuna link, which is the Mahakali in Nepal. So that links with, so that's number 5, that links with 6 to the Yamuna Rajasthan, and ultimately 7, which is Rajasthan Sabarmati, which Sabarmati is the river that flows through Ahmedabad, Modi's home state. And so he's been talking a fair amount about this in a press release just a couple weeks ago. And so the linchpin in this, of course, though, is the Pancheshwar Dam, which I'll talk about in a moment, in order to bring water from the Himalayan area all the way down to Gujarat. So the Pancheshwar Dam project, or PDP, it's located in Pancheshwar, Uttarakhand, which is right here, as probably all of you know, on the Nepal-India border, just a few kilometers in actually, but it's going to be, if enacted, it's proposed as the world's highest dam, right? So going back to thinking about India and modernity, and developing its hydro resources and creating a kind of spectacle in the Nehruvian sense, right? A modern temple. This is 5 meters higher than the world's other large dam, which is in China. It'll flood 11,600 hectares, much of that in India, but 4,000 hectares in Nepal. It's slated to produce about 5,000 megawatts of hydropower. Though that number changes, it goes between 5,000 and 6,800 actually. And so these are estimates, and I'll talk about those in a minute. At a cost of $4 billion US. And then it creates a smaller dam on the Sarda River in India that's about 81 meters high. Okay, so it creates one large reservoir that will straddle India and Nepal, and then a smaller reservoir downstream on the Sarda tributary of the Ganga that will be fully in India. And that becomes important in a moment. And so right now, the Mahakali Treaty from 1996 is being renegotiated between India and Nepal. The current terms which are being negotiated include this quote, or this part of the treaty, which says, India and Nepal will have equal entitlement in the utilization of the waters of the Mahakali River without prejudice to their respective existing consumptive uses of waters of the Mahakali River. So what that means is it's basically legal speak to say that, okay, Nepal is not using all the water it could on the Mahakali, but this treaty does not limit Nepal, or India, for that matter, to its current consumptive uses. Okay, so many surface water agreements say, well, you're currently using X number of cubic meters of water per day, that's all you get. Okay, so it's not saying that, it's saying that, that it's going to be equal for now into the future. Okay, and the current flow, average flow of the Mahakali is 730 million cubic meters per second. No, wait, sorry, meters per second. 730 cubic meters per second. A cubic meter is 1,000 liters. Okay, so water volume in a river is is flow, and so that's a lot of water, right? So 700 cubic meters per second. That's on average. In the high season, it can be up to 1,500. In the low season, it can be down to about 300. Okay, so it does fluctuate throughout the year. Nepal's allocation under the Mahakali is 28 cubic meters per second in the wet season and about 4 in the dry season. Okay, so again, over 700 cubic meters per second is the total flow on average. Here, if we average those out, that's about 26, right? So there's a big mismatch. Sorry?
60 or
60? Sorry? Oh, sorry, it's cubic meters per second, is that what you're asking?
the average of the two is 16.
No.
Oh, sorry, I was averaging the wet and dry season, so 28 plus 4, 32.
Divided by 2 is
Oh, 16, yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's right, I wasn't thinking. And then under the treaty also is that India must allow 10 cubic meters per second for ecosystem function. But ecosystem function is also defined by them as well. And so we can ask them, first, what is equal entitlement? Okay, and so, as I said, the total average flow is over 700 cubic meters per second. 34% of the Mahakali Basin is in Nepal, and so arguably equal entitlement would be more like 248 cubic meters per second on average, rather than that much lower number, either 28 or 4 or 16. But they're starting from quite a low base number, okay, and trying to get up to this number on the Nepal side will be quite a challenge, I think. And so other aspects that are under development is that the Mahakali Treaty laid the groundwork to create a Pancheshwar Development Authority, which is made up of both Indian and Nepali engineers, as well as policy people who come from not only the water sector, but also the electricity sector. To date, I believe they've had 6 meetings. The latest was in April 2018 here in Kathmandu. And also the treaty created what they're calling a detailed project report, which has not been released either, which is, okay, what would this dam actually look like, how would it be constructed, and what kind of hydro turbines would be installed, all of that. So, but the treaty left a series of terms left to be negotiated, which are being negotiated now in the present. And these center around the benefits and distribution of benefits of energy, irrigation, and also flood control, right? And so flood control could be quite important. Thinking about Bangladesh is often on the losing end of Indian flood control upriver, right? And that could have some effects upriver if depending on the terms of that. But also sharing of capital costs. So who's going to pay for the two dams, as well as other infrastructure and how much, as well as the distribution of electricity. And India's current argument is that they're proposing that India pay more because India can get better finance terms globally, in part, and is better equipped to take out the scale of loan that is required to build the dam. So in order to do that, they're also saying that they should get the lion's share of the benefits. I should say the Mahakali Treaty is a 75-year treaty to be revisited in 10-year intervals, and so that's being revisited now, and will be revisited in the future as well. Also, India claims all of the water from the lower Sarda Dam. Okay, so even though arguably 34% of the drainage basin is in, or is 34% of the drainage basin of Mahakali is in Nepal, the other part is in India. They're claiming all of that water that goes into the second dam reservoir that'll be in Uttarakhand. So all of this focus on the benefits and distribution of benefits, as well as some of the basic assumptions about the hydrologic character of the Mahakali Basin, which, as I noted, have a lot of variability between dry season and wet season, and have interseasonal averages. Much of that is changing, and it's not clear whether that's the case right now. So one of the aspects of this treaty is that it's based on absolute numbers rather than percentages. And so there's debate right now, too, whether the treaty ought to be based on percentages, meaning that rather than Nepal being allocated a certain number of cusecs of water or cubic meters of water, it should be a percentage of the flow. And so that's being debated. Typically, that's a better way to form surface water treaties is around percentages because the absolute quantities fluctuate. But within this, of course, we have a series of challenges in the Himalayan region, first of which is climate change. And so according to most recent research in Himalayan glaciers, there's a high degree of uncertainty. Most glaciers are declining, but mostly at globally average rates, so not any faster than anywhere else, except the Karakoram are actually getting larger. But very recent work presented at the AGU this year, American Geophysical Union, that is, from Bhushan, noted that there's been significant mass loss, which again is on par with what's happening in other parts of the world in glaciated areas. And that is actually, interestingly, right now producing greater than average stream flows. Okay, so one of the problems that we've seen from the American West in particular is that treaties were negotiated for river sharing and water sharing during periods of high flow, and abnormally high flow perhaps. And then decades later, the flows were much less, and those were much more on par with average. And so this is very possibly the case here, where we have greater than average stream flows now because of high melting, but it's projected to decrease and have actually lower than average stream flows in the future. So one would argue that it's very crucial that the renegotiation of the treaty becomes based on percentages of flow rather than absolute quantities, which may or may not be there. Also, very recent work in 2018 in the Mahakali Basin in particular, based on two different climate models and comparing them, showed that between 2020 and 2095 we're expected to have an increase in daily high temperatures of up to 2.3 degrees Celsius, but also an increase in daily minimum temperatures by the same amount. They're almost the mirror, right? So we tend to focus on increases in daily highs, but scientists argue that increases in daily low temperatures is also extremely important, especially when we're talking about glacial melting, and so warmer throughout. And initially, we're experiencing rising precipitation, but then declining. right? So not only do we have increased melting right now, but also increased precipitation in the area that is going to taper off over time, which again, negotiating the treaty on the current environmental basis could be problematic in the future. And so this draws into question then, in other words, the various benefits for irrigation, potential hydro benefits, as well as for drinking water and hydroelectricity. I was thinking about it as I was creating this talk, and I think a really interesting project would be to look at all the dams, hydroelectric dams produced globally, and look at what their projected hydro potential was before construction, and look at what their actual hydro production was after construction. Because my sense is and my hunch is that they're never as high as their initial projections. Electricity generation is always lower. And if we have increasing fluctuations in the Mahakali Basin, then we would have fluctuations with respect to hydroelectricity generation. Second is earthquakes, as we know, right? This is a very seismically active area. In 1833, there was a 7.5 magnitude earthquake with epicenter 15 kilometers from the proposed dam site. And in 1980, there was a 6.5 magnitude earthquake. And there have been a number of pieces written today, I should have cited them, I just realized, that talk about accumulated seismic energy in this space. So much of the energy released in the 2015 earthquake did not release energy from this area. That all went in a different direction, as you know. And so seismologists are saying there's still a lot of accumulated energy, right? You have the Indian plate colliding with the Eurasian plate, and that's still ongoing. And so when we think about that second then, with a process called reservoir-induced seismicity, this is something that has been documented in a number of cases where when you have when you dam a valley and you create, especially in a tectonically active area, you create all the extra pressure from a large reservoir, then that can produce seismic activity as well. And again, people who are critical of the river linking project and this dam at Pancheshwar in particular want to know what the seismic studies are showing, and those are not being released properly by the Indian government. Third aspect that's very problematic, in particular in India, is its history of relocating so-called project-affected people, right? We know from the Narmada. But the projection for the Indian river linking project is within India is several million people displaced, and resettling these people who are farmers, laborers, Adivasis, are not included in cost projections. So they're not included in that $186 billion price tag for that, nor is land compensation. And so in the Mahakali transfer that I'm talking about just now, that's projected to displace 30,000 families on the Indian side. I haven't been able to find a projection on the Nepal side. And so far there's no plan to resettle, again, what the Indian state calls project-affected people. So I'd be interested to know if anybody's seen any projections on a displacement for the Nepal side. So I want to begin to conclude here, again, with a second quote from Nehru that puts into tension his previous thinking. So in 1958, with respect to development, he said, we as India, meaning we're suffering from what we may call a disease of gigantism, right? Where everything's bigger and bigger. And so thinking about putting the context or creating this being a context in which India's globally largest dam is being constructed, I think is interesting in coming full circle. Also, because the river linking plan views water scarcity as a physical problem and infrastructure development as a solution to that problem, overlooked is the kind of social, political, and technical problem of irrigation, wastage, and leakage. And so existing water use efficiency from dams in India is about 30 to 40%. So some of that is lost through evaporation, but much of it is lost through leakage of poor quality canals like this one in Rajasthan, which are partly concrete but often earthen as well. And irrigated efficiency is only about 30 to 50%, or 40 to 50%, excuse me, right? And so, so when we think about enhancing irrigation and growing the irrigated area, there's a lot to be gained in the much less interesting realm of trying to enhance irrigated efficiency rather than building large mega projects. So to conclude, the Indian River Linking Project has a really long history going back to the colonial period, grounded in population and scarcity questions, but also modernity. And I think that that is coming into play in the contemporary period, in the Modi government in particular, who's been focused on large-scale infrastructure and building global cities and the like. And this really plays itself out in the Mahakali Yamuna link, which again, the Yamuna links to Rajasthan, Rajasthan links to Sabarmati. And so, if you're not aware of it, before when Modi was chief minister of Gujarat, the Sabarmati, which flows through Ahmedabad, he raised that entire area, removed all the ghats from the river, removed all of the informal settlements from the river, and transformed it into a river walk development for high-end mass consumption. And so, but it needs more water, and so he's looking for water sources. He's looking to do that in other parts of India as well. And then finally, the project is based in notions of state security that I think really looks at human and ecological costs as really irrelevant to the needs to secure the state. And that's fleshing itself out and reorienting the treaty towards Indian water security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Now, as I said, I don't know where to start. Let me just say this. First, what you did was to put start with a micro context. You articulated the kind of the notion of water security. The water security perhaps at a much more community household individual level. And then sort of juxtapose that in the sort of a grand story that's going on. You started with the colonial story of how Arthur Cotton, he was incidentally an engineer in the Madras presidency. He was in the south. And then this guy had a fight with the other guy in the north, which was probably Cotton. So between these two provinces, the United Provinces and the Madras presidency, they had a big intellectual fight as to which particular model of irrigation would be pursued in India. Arthur Cotton sort of, apart from this, argued that the head works, particularly the analyse, in the Kaveri River, which is Varas has been built since the Chola Empire. This should be managed by the state, but the canals should be managed by the community. And the guy in the north, the Cotton said no, everything in the south, under the state. So what you essentially see is very interesting intermixing of two paradigms. You have the colonial paradigm in India, where the basic objective of irrigation development and intervention in water were three objectives. The first was political control. The second was revenue generation, and the third was providing supplemental irrigation. It also, sort of aimed to address the aftermath of the sort of famine that had occurred. That's one. But then you also see similar trend in the United States that, as the West was reclaimed, this started from moving from West towards the Western United States. The whole idea was to move water across the landscape, and then was to, in a utilitarian sense, meet the needs of population for drinking water, irrigation, and energy generation. So the whole enterprise, the enterprise, the Bureau of Reclamation, US Army Corps of Engineers, etc., was attuned to providing a functioning that needs at the cost of the downstream, at the cost of the, the community, the deltas, and so forth. So much so that, if you go to some of the rivers in the United States, the Colorado, for example, is dead by the time it reaches the Gulf of Mexico. There is no water. So people ask, where does the Colorado go? And then you said that, the river's water has been allocated, more water has been allocated than is in the river. So that's where the whole idea of West comes in. You see the narrative of flowing water as a West in colonial India. You also see the narrative of West flowing water as a West in the United States. The Columbia River, so much water flowing by rivers. So therefore, there are some stories which say, even criminal to allow that water to flow. So that then brings me back to this whole idea of sort of knowledge and understanding and sort of science. If you look at hydrology, if you look at the scientific definition of hydrology, it talks about water evaporating from the ocean and then coming to the land and then coming down, through precipitation and then, nurturing landscape and then streams and rivers and going back, and then that cycle continues, essentially. And there is no sink and source as far as water is concerned. So where does this notion of West come? If there is no source and sink, where does this come? But the fact is, it's interesting how the political dispensation sort of, picks up the idea and then sort of, manipulates it, takes it along, for meeting its need. Other point I just wanted to mention before I open the floor was, you said about Nehru, but then maybe there was, I thought he said about temples in 1963. Is that right?
Yeah, but before he said.
Well, before he said exactly. Nehru is, is the architect of modern India. It's a tremendous contribution. But then a secularist, a social, sort of Fabian socialist and all that. When he talked about Bhakra being, temple of modern India, I'm surprised. Why doesn't he recognize that the state will take care of these, 30,000-40,000 people who will display? Why does it justify by saying, you have to sort of, sacrifice for the, sort of a larger benefit, larger benefit of why does it say that? That's a question I've asked to a lot of my Indian historians. And by the way, if you get a chance, read a book by a historian called Michael Burley. He has some scathing write-up on Nehru. So histories are always very, brutal provisions there. So very interesting. Lots of things to talk about. And you link the Mahakali Treaty. Let me just end by saying, I think one of the biggest problems, this is some of the negotiators currently engaged in Mahakali Treaty have been sort of sharing with me, important of course, that the treaty, the Mahakali Treaty is very open, in some sense it's a very prescriptive sort of specific treaty. It specifies 10 meter cube for ecosystem flow. But at the same time it provides nothing to sort of mention how much water in Nepal will get or India will get. If you take one scenario, I've done this calculation in 1996, if you take one scenario, Nepal would end up getting 4% of the regulated. If you take other scenario, it could be 49%. So there is lots of scope for interpretation. And what the negotiators tell me is that because of the ambiguous provision in the treaty which you highlighted, that each party will have rights to quarter of the market without compromising or prejudicing the existing views, right? Claiming right for Lower Sarda Canal, which is not mentioned in the Mahakali Treaty. Lower Sarda Canal is about 120 kilometers downstream of Sarda Barrage.
Yeah.
So therefore, that they tell me is a sticking point. And then they said this is a political question. You have to address this political. Nothing that you can do at the technical level. Anyway. The floor is yours, I'm sorry. Yeah, questions. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then Trevor will respond and we'll come back again.
Yes. I wish you had done more to connect the Mahakali. You did mention it, but to connect it to the title of the talk, the river linking, in the sense that it's very important for us here in Nepal to know your views on the Mahakali, which is well taken. But then further, because for me it was a shock to understand, realize that it is actually going to end up in Sabarmati, which is actually a danger signal, because Modi needs the water. Because right now the Sabarmati is essentially a lake, a recreational lake, what he has converted in, but clearly there's a need there. And so if that is going to power the need for this lake, that is one question. The other is the very real question, when you do fly over the Rajasthan, Punjab, Haryana areas, you do see the impact of the Indira Gandhi Canal and the greening. And that is a real greening as far as I can make out. So how do you fight against the juggernaut that is the potential greening of this whole area? And with Modi's added interest, he might not push other canals of the river linking, but this one, it seems he is going to go for it. So we have to, how do we prepare the other side, not to be Luddite and not to say nothing to nothing, and not we won't do anything with it, but to have arguments that will be good for the ecology, for the people. I think 30,000 displaced, Mr. Modi will just run roughshod over those.
That's India, right?
That's India. Even India.
Nepal will be over 50,000.
No, still, let's just talk even about India, because in the end, if the Pancheshwar is not to be, or is it to be made in a shorter size, that's lower level. There's something of interest to both sides. So I think 30,000 on India, you'd expect that is the area of Chipko. So will there be great movements to stop it so that Nepal gets it pretty? No, I think Mr. Modi will find various ways to run roughshod. So two questions. One is the actual greening that will be brought about by the river linking. And second, this Modi factor, how much does that, is that now a challenge for Nepal itself?
Yeah.
Should I just answer one at a time?
Yeah, sorry.
It's kind of a big question.
Sorry, all right, sorry.
It's two-part, but I'll try to answer quickly and we can go back to it if we have time. The first part I think is, so with Pancheshwar, yes, there could be a discussion of having it lower, right? One of the critiques in the Indian side, and there are a number of lawsuits right now too, to try to get a formal impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, because it's not been done properly or released at some of the material bases. So maybe it could be constructed at a lower level, still provide some of the benefit. And as you say, like you raise a really interesting tension that I don't deal with, which is like, do you reject the whole thing, or do you, as a Luddite, or do you say, well, these areas, there's some need for this water and some development, right? And how we define development and who benefits from that could be part of the debate. With respect to what Modi wants in Gujarat, I do bring that up. I think it's conjecture. I think, from my perspective, that he hasn't said much publicly on, from the perspective of whether this is a pet project, or whether it's grounded in some other economic and political and ecological basis. But it seems to be important to him for those reasons that we might surmise, coming from Gujarat, which patronage politics have a long history in India, of course. But on the greening part, the Indira Gandhi is an interesting question because it has greened that northwestern corner of Rajasthan, but there have been a number of issues as well. So it created waterlogging, and it still does, which creates salinization, so it raised the water tables in places, which then had to be drained. There's been a number of issues with the canal silting in from the Pakistan side with wind, and there's not money allocated to maintain it. And then even I wrote a piece, and this has been in the public press, popular press too, that the city of Jodhpur in western Rajasthan, when the Indira Gandhi began getting water, it began getting its water from Indira Gandhi. So they stopped pumping groundwater. Well, the groundwater levels raised, and then it began eating away at the limestone foundations of their historical buildings. And so they had to start pumping water and pumping it out of the area. So these kind of unintended consequences are very interesting, I think. Yeah.
In some strategic circles, somebody said Rajasthan Canal is the biggest anti-tank ditch.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a nice straight shot.
Just across the board.
Thank you for your
Thanks very much. This is a question that's about the object of development and what the sort of ideology or the public ideology is behind some of these projects. You showed very effectively that this river linking project descends directly from a 19th century aggressively technocratic approach to development. At the same time, the mid-20th century projects in India and Pakistan always highlighted the benefit to the common man, now we might say common person, as the point, the ultimate point of these, which seems slightly different from the national security rhetoric. And at the same time, the development sector in general has neoliberalized and focused on decentralized, devolved, addressing individuals and individual families. So is the kind of rhetoric that you're talking about completely opposed to this other interpretation of development, or is there a link I'm missing?
Yeah. Good question. So another part of this project is looking at this as the return to big infrastructure that's completely consistent with neoliberal style development based on financialization. And so while the 20th century projects were all funded through public finance, through World Bank funding also, but through the public sector ultimately. A lot of the money for Indian river linking is coming from the private sector, and I would argue that it's actually being driven by the private sector. Because political economists like David Harvey and others have argued that there's a crisis of overaccumulation, meaning there's too much capital being held in banks, and it needs places to invest. Investment financiers are looking for capital projects to invest in. They don't want small projects, they want big ones where they can put all their money in one spot and have the public essentially guarantee it. And so what I'm trying to find out is how are these projects being financed? And so I think they're very consistent with a new form of big infrastructure in the 21st century that are financed for private financial gain, where the risk is borne by the public. And so it's a very different model of large-scale development. And so this large-scale infrastructure is, I think, a product of that in part.
So, like, can you tell us about the particular interlinking that you showed? Who are the private sector actors involved?
Yeah.
Some thought, some idea.
Yeah, so who are the private sector actors involved? I'm trying to figure this out, actually. So they're sovereign wealth funds, and I don't know the names yet. I'm trying to work with Indian colleagues to do information requests to see if we can get who the financiers are involved. But it's looking at, and they're not releasing the specific project documents. So for instance, the links that are underway, like the Ken Baitwa and the one in the Kaveri that's been done, part of that funding is known to have come from private interests, but it's not clear who yet.
I have basically 4 questions regarding the Indian water linking project. So while we are discussing about this water linking project, we must not forget that Nepal is a signatory of ILO 169. So we can't go rampant on the mountains and build dams arbitrarily. And if we look at the Indian Indo-Nepal water diplomacy in 1923, 60s and 90s are paramount importance. And even through this treaty, we can clearly see on which side the treaties are skewed. So I have basically 4 questions. One on human security, second is on riparian issues, third is the dams and the promises. So are we reorienting the definition of human security itself? Because we are more focusing on the axis rather at the expense of culture, land and belonging. So I was quite surprised we didn't talk about the proposed Kosi High Dam, because the Kosi High Dam itself will affect more than 900 VDCs in 9 different districts and will inundate 9 districts and it will displace 75,000 people on Nepal side itself, only on the Nepali side. So, and for the riparian issues, India is building dam against Indus Water Treaty, and the arbitrator, here the arbitrator is the World Bank, and World Bank itself is the new spectator of the breaching of this treaty. So, who will regulate all these treaties? Second, question on the dam. So, with all this inundation in our side, why should we allow these giant dams inundate our land? After all, this is an equal dynamics of our national interest. So, and the third question regarding the dams and the promises. We have seen Farakka barrage, because the Farakka barrage is more of a curse to Bangladesh, which was initially it was supposed to be it was first proposed to hold the flood inundation in the Padma River. So with all these seeds going into the Farakka barrage, we have seen it has created more inundation that now it has been more of a curse to Bangladesh itself. And India has never been up to its promises. We have seen the promise that India made with Bhutan of 15,000 megawatt energy after 2007 treaty. So, and the debate of surface as being a public property and a private property is there. So how will we address these three questions? The question of human security, question of riparian issue, and third of dam and promises.
Yeah, I think those are excellent questions. To take the last one, you mentioned Farakka. One of the river links is proposed to divert water upstream from that, which India cannot do under its current agreement with Bangladesh. So it's trying to renegotiate with Bangladesh as well. But you're right. I mean, these treaties are negotiated in international courts, but India wouldn't have to respond. And so I think that's one of the the dangers, if you will, right? I mean, even with Pakistan, which India views as a much more formidable opponent, they're also doing stuff upriver on the Indus and in the basin. And so I think it does feed into this notion of national security, that India is willing to throw its weight around, but also to push the boundaries of legality. And this is also, people who have studied treaties much more than me have argued and written about that India really prefers bilateral treaties rather than multilateral. So they want to negotiate with Nepal separately from Bangladesh, right? Whereas it would be in legal theory, it would be in Nepal and Bangladesh's interest to negotiate together with India, especially around the Ganga. And so, but that hasn't happened because India refuses. On the human security question, I think you raise a really great point. And that is what civil society organizations in India are bringing up. And so far, the state has been mostly tone deaf, or mostly non-responsive on that question. And it goes back to what Ajay was saying. I'm thinking about this question of which we've moved, which I think was central to the Nehruvian period, which was, does some part of the population have to sacrifice to serve the broader population, right? It was sort of a Jeremy Bentham utilitarian approach. And at that time, it was viewed as no, that you don't. And now, it's almost taken as an assumption that that's okay. Because and the people that would be displaced in this area, especially Adivasis, are viewed as being in need of development. And it's being assumed that displacement would be the best thing for them, actually. And of course, that's a very false premise, but it's one that the state, I think, is pushing implicitly, if not explicitly, in this context.
How will the river diverting project will impact the river Ganga, whether and what will be the political impact of that in the states of UP and Bihar, if that, whether or not BJP or Modi can, take that impact, or calculate that impact of the river diverting project. So the political impact of that on UP and Bihar, and that's impact on the national polity of India. So can you tell us?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So first, part of the talk I cut out of this particular talk is that the RSS has come out against the river linking because it disrupts their notion of continuous flow, agral dharma, right? Which is that that you can't disrupt the flow of the Ganga. But then the BJP has argued, well, it's all the Ganga, so we can't disrupt the flow. But that hasn't stopped the RSS from coming out against it, especially in UP, actually. But if you look at the map of the, oops, oh, it went away, sorry. But there are a number of other links in the basin. So while the Sarda Yamuna link would remove water from the upper reaches of the Ganga, another link would return some water back to the Ganga. And so it's not clear, again, what the overall net influence would be of flows in other states. So there are two, I think, outcomes of what you're saying. One, there could be diminished stream flow, which that water is being utilized downstream. But then two, there's or maybe I'm imposing this on your question, forgive me if I am, but a kind of socio-religious question around this, around some of Modi's base, which are not happy with this whole notion of reworking India's river systems. Yes?
Thank you for your very interesting talk. You see, what is the issue, you will find it may create some internal conflict as well as international conflict also. Of course, you know very well that in many areas, because of the drinking water problem, they had this interstate conflict. And during certain time, India and Pakistan, they had the conflict on water issue. At the same time, they had the same problem with Bangladesh also. Now, because of this, as you talked quite a long on the Pancheshwar issue, right from the Kosi project, you see, Nepal and India always had some sort of misunderstanding or some sort of conflict, you see. Conflict may be very of low aim, but we understand there is conflict, you see. So, after this river linkage in India, what is your thinking that what will be its overall impact on Nepal's river system? Because as you know very well, that all Nepal rivers end in India. So I think this may create some conflict between India and Nepal, we say, on the issue of water.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. That's maybe better suited for him, actually, because that's clearly a hot button issue. I mean, as you noted, the existing treaties institutionalize the downstream user's right to water, right? Historically, under most treaty negotiations, people assume that the downstream riparian state is at a weaker position than the upstream. So India has tried since, well, before independence, because the British created this boundary right in the Mahakali between India and Nepal. So it was debated then. So I didn't go back to that history, but that was debated in the early 20th century. And India wasn't happy about it then, actually, because typically when a river separates two countries, it's the center of that river, which is the boundary, and then the flow would be divided equally, and that wasn't the case. And so I think, entering into an agreement, India is going to assume that it's going to try to get more than Nepal in this case, and that's been the case historically. And I think India probably thinks with the Mahakali way out in western Nepal, what is Nepal going to do with that water anyway? I think is an assumption. I'm not saying that, but I think that that's partly what their engineers and political folks are thinking. It's not clear to me if they'll, what the plan will be to distribute hydroelectricity, say for instance, if that's generated in Pancheshwar. There is some plan to create infrastructure on the Nepal side, but the specific modalities of that, financing, who will be in charge of it and overseeing it, I think is another question, especially up for negotiation is with the fluctuating river system, which will mean fluctuating electricity generation, how will that be dealt with as well? And these are all things that are being negotiated now. And I don't think much of it is open for public debate. It'll be similar to what's happening in the US. It'll just be, this is what it's going to be. We're not having a debate about it in the public. Do you think, or what do you think?
So I'll tell you the challenge, Pratish.
I just have a question. at one point, I used to know quite a bit about the Mahakali Treaty because I used to pretend to be living a life of a public intellectual in the 60s. And when I gave up that life, a lot of the researcher garbage that has gotten into my head, I've forgotten. I mean, I can understand why you use the Mahakali Panceshwar example because you're speaking in Kathmandu. I could figure that out. We academics do that all the time. But if I remember correctly, I mean, if I understood the chronology that you presented to us, 1990s was not particularly a time where the river linking thing was prominent in India.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
So
yeah.
therefore, if this treaty took place in the mid-1990s, possibly there were some other dynamics driving this particular treaty rather than the river linking mega project. So I think you probably need to be sensitive to the fact that although you use the example of that in this talk, and I think Kanakji was hinting at that when he asked the question earlier, maybe there is some other dynamics that's driven the India-Nepal Panceshwar thing, right? And so if that's true, then you need to probably rethink your use of this as an example to illustrate the larger point.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I think it still serves as an example, I think, but maybe perhaps a bit of a different one. So when I read the Treaty of 1996 in the context surrounding it, they're already talking about building a multi-purpose project, they were calling it, Panceshwar multi-purpose project. And that included irrigation, hydroelectricity, and drinking water. So that was already there and was not being discussed as part of the broader river interlinking project. So you're right, that was folded into the river linking project. So it'd be interesting to, one angle would be to examine it, how the river linking project planners folded that into the river linking project more broadly, because it stood apart. Now the popular press accounts I've read during the time of the creation in 1996 was that there was anxiety on both sides of wanting to get a treaty on the Mahakali. So India was anxious about it, Nepal was anxious about it too, and Nepal was quite happy, I believe, politically speaking, at that time, to get an agreement. I don't know. That's maybe not, happy is not the word, but there was broad agreement in the government around doing an agreement. So that's not the rest of Nepal, but the government was quite pleased. There have also been discussions from I think Nepali intellectuals that the 96 agreement is unconstitutional because it was created under a different government that's been disbanded and recreated. And so there's a question around that as too about the constitutionality and international legality of the current agreement. And I think maybe India is a bit wanting to renegotiate with the current government so that it's a bit more solid too. But thank you, I take your point very well, and I think that is an interesting way to look at it, that I need to look at it.
Just an additional point in relation to Propitia's comment. I think you can relate it to the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative that China is pushing. Everything that has been done in the last 30 years is suddenly being termed as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah. So the train that came to Shigase came independent of the Belt and Road Initiative, but now that is supposed to be part of it. Likewise, I think now it's an evolved planning by the Indian state where Panceshwar now becomes part of the river linking project. Right. But an additional point, because we are focusing on Nepal, but looking at that map, the word brazen comes to my mind. Here is what? B-R-A-Z-E, brazen. Looking at that map, look at Bangladesh and look at the diversion of Luit and Brahmaputra, all the waters, just through the chicken's neck to the Indian side. So even if you did not think of Bangladesh, for a moment, don't think of the national borders. Think of the hundreds of millions, well, 190 million people, I guess, Bangladesh, in that delta, and you're depriving them of the crucial flow after already having taken away the flow of the Ganga via Faraka. Then you're going to take away the Brahmaputra. The humanitarian crisis and geopolitical explosion that is going to be, even to draw that map requires an insensitivity of humongous proportions, not only ecological, humanitarian, but geopolitical.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I fully agree with you on that second point. On the first point, I think you're right. I really appreciate you relating it to the Chinese project, which is true. In fact, there's a link happening in Rajasthan right now that is now part of the river linking project that it's not part of this at all. It'd be a 31st link, right? And they're 30 right now. And part of that is that the central government planners in their budget this year, they didn't achieve it, but they were trying to make a separate line item for the river linking project. And the reason that they wanted to do that, because if they can do that and allocate X number of crore towards that, then they don't have to get parliamentary approval for individual projects. It's already done because it's part of the project. And so they're folding things into it, trying to get a line item for it, and then they can just begin funding some of these projects. Whereas right now, it's approved in theory, but they have to go back to Parliament for all the funding for it.
Any more questions, please? Right, okay.
Thank you very much for your questions. Just a couple of points I just wanted to highlight. One was, if you look at Southeast Asia, you essentially have a hydrohegemony. You have a hydrohegemony which have one set of principles for the upstream and you have one set of principles for the downstream. And how do you reconcile with economies? That's a major challenge. Second, if you look at the writings and arguments and social movements and lessons and learnings and so on and so forth over the last 35 years, you clearly have a narrative that you could counter every argument of the state. That the human security, water management essentially is not what it is. That you can contest that narrative. Now the problem is like the space for that contestation, is perhaps tricky. Asking critical questions and being upfront about it, I think is tricky. Many years ago when I wrote about Mahakali, I argued that the debate, you mentioned about earthquake, you mentioned about reservoirs, electricity, you mentioned about cost, you mentioned about displacement, you mentioned about ecosystem and so on and so forth. Now those were the debates that went on in India, in Narmada, in Tehri. Right? Now Tehri is what, 160 kilometers from Mahakali. Now you're going to face exactly the same debate in Pacheshwar. But we do not have in Nepal the kind of, at least at that point you had that social space in India where people could ask questions. You had, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, you had the Tehri movement, and you had a whole lot of analysts like Vijay Paranspe and others, sort of providing the counter narrative. You will not that have in Nepal. That space is gone. So that's something we have to think carefully. How do you counter that? This phenomenon. And let me end by saying, history actually matters. When Pratyush was asking this question, I was thinking, oh yeah, okay. I remember in 1993 we were traveling in Bihar and we had somebody from India's this river linking outfit. It was called Indian National something INWT. They would go around, circulating the brochures. This Undanu project, Virility, so they hear, all that stuff. This was in 1993. So I think what we're seeing is march of the hydraulic mission in South Asia. So it's more related to paradigm. If I could just take one more point, if you look at Pacheshwar, the mission actually starts as a part of the colonial enterprise in 1857. 1857 when we had the India's first war of independence, in the Awadh, and then 12 years after that rebellion, the proposal for Sarada barrage was proposed, mooted for the first time. It was opposed. It was opposed by the Talukdars of Awadh because they said it would not be needed. So it kept on being postponed. It kept on being proposed. It kept on being opposed. And in 1901, Lord Curzon was the Governor General of India, and he constituted a commission, and then again proposed Sharda Barrage. And then at that point, the colonial government had become very smart, and they said, okay, if you don't want it from the Mahakali River, Mahakali or Sarda River will be the barrage that will take the water all the way to Agra and Delhi using the Ganga Canal, because the water is being wasted. So that's the first time the language of West comes to in the sort of in discourse. And at that point, the Talukdar said, "Oh, we don't want our waters to be taken to Agra, but allow them to build it." Nothing about Bihar, nothing about downstream, Uttar Pradesh, nothing about Bengal, nothing about Delta. So therefore, that enterprise continues in its varied form and has arrived at congestion. So therefore, there's something to recognize. Well, once again, thank you. We could go on, you could cut this cake in so many different ways. You could look at water security, you could look at the state's perspective. But thank you very much for sort of giving us a broad sort of perspective of these two views and highlighting some of the gaps and how we might look at the challenge of water. So on behalf of Baha, and then also Martin, right? Martin also organized this conference. Why not, Prothush? Yeah, Martin Chaudhary and all of us. I take this opportunity to thank you very much for your talk. Thank you.